Thank you, Professor Major. We're now open we have some time for questions. I think there's one question listed for Hermione, if she's available. I don't know if she can read the questions, but the question is it possible to identify a point, if one exists, at which the Allied powers began to focus resources into the post-war investments versus the Axis powers abandoning post-war considerations to focus purely on wartime survival? I hope you can see that.
Okay, yeah, I got it. The question of do we see the shift from the wartime to the post-war investment? That's a very good question. I would say, I mean, because you see some companies very early on are already looking at the post-war. So do we see it from the RAF point of view? I think the whole time they're hedging their bets. I mean, it took about 5 years to develop a piston engine fully, so that was kind of the expectation I think they had. So I think right from the beginning, actually, of the war, it's sort of we will support everything, both what might appear soon and longer term investments. And so it's absolutely after the war, immediately after the war, you see Britain is in the strongest position of any power, and I think that reflects sort of foresight really from the outbreak of war. Really, I mean, I guess the time horizons are always a bit vague, but I'd say there's no distinct point, but it seems to be there the whole time. Yeah.
Hermione, I did have one question for you. That's Ted Young. Sure. In the course of your research on jet engines, you mentioned the British looking at a post-war market. Did you come across any evidence that during the war, as these engines were just beginning to develop, that they were actually considering jet-powered commercial airliners? Or was that really a post-war phenomenon?
Well, somebody just pointed out the Brabazon Commission suggests when there was thoughts in those directions, but I think there was never any discussion of it except in the military context. No. And in Germany also they had from before the war they were told, okay, this is going to take 10, 15 years to develop. So they knew it, but their government dismissed it, and we see a very different development than in Britain. But no, very, very strongly military anyway.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience for any of our speakers?
I'd like to ask a question of Gary Willis, if I may. Can I go ahead? Yes. Gary, I wanted to ask you whether there were any cases of airfields being used for agricultural purposes while the runways and the facilities were maintained after the war, or was there a strict separation between agricultural use and Air Force use?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, there were a great many airfields where it was mixed use, depending on military need. And yeah, there's a lot more that could be said about the subject than I was able to squeeze into 15 minutes. But yeah, I mean, it required, however, quite a lot of resources in terms of dividing up the actual runways and territory within an airfield needed for use on an ongoing basis from those areas which could be used for agriculture. It required fencing. It required fencing material, gates for access. It wasn't just an easy thing. Oh yeah, take that bit and farm it. Land was given on the basis of 1 year minus 3 days at that time because of the uncertainty, as I mentioned in my talk. So yes, I mean the categories which I put up on the PowerPoint reflect, if you look into more detail, very nuanced ways in which the agricultural community still at that time the War Executive Agricultural Committees and the RAF kind of did a dance with one another in terms of who needed what at one time for how long. It certainly wasn't a cut and dried issue of, okay, we don't need this airfield anymore. It can go back to farmland in perpetuity. It was very much kind of a mixed use over a great many airfields.
We have one other question for Gary Willis. Were there any local protests against the requisition of land or for airfields or other uses during the time?
It varies. If you're looking at, it varies between the pre-war period, the wartime period, and post-war. If you look at what CPRE were looking to do, Council for the Preservation of Rural England, they were took quite a kind of hard questioning line as they could when the Air Ministry started to requisition or buy up land without much of a consultation process from the mid-30s onwards. But as war started to definitely come on the horizon and be evident to everyone, CPRE, who were, if you look at the people involved, they were an establishment organization. They certainly weren't a pacifist one. Then, they got behind the war effort, and their focus switched to the post-war reconstruction settlement in terms of trying to ensure that land returned to something like its original use after the war. So amenity organizations like CPRE and other organizations, they were much more kind of vociferous prior to the war and after it, and generally supported the war effort. Although, where during the wartime, if the Air Ministry proposed a site they'd got their eyes on, there was by this time a meaningful consultation process, and occasionally CPRE were able to direct the Air Ministry towards an alternative site which had maybe less agricultural value. But CPRE were very adept at couching their own amenity interests in terms of the agricultural value of sites, because they knew that pressed certain buttons and won them friends within the Ministry of Agriculture.
Well, I think that takes us to the end of our session. We're now going for a break for 15 minutes. And would you please all join me in thanking our presenters for some fascinating papers. Collective thank you, however, we can do that electronically.